Hi everyone. Today we will be talking about conducting experiments. So this is kind of the next segue for us, kind of transitioning from talking about sort of basic experimental designs. Now we're sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of exactly what we can expect with conducting experiments. And then in our next chapter, we'll talk about some of the more complex experimental designs. So when you are selecting your research participants for an experimental design, you really need to think about the sample itself. Is your sample representative of the general population? And we want to make sure that it is representative, right, of our population as a whole. So if we are going to make a comparison to the United States population, then the representation within our specific sample in our research study should be largely related then to the population in the United States. You also want to think about the fact that when you are having that really diverse sample, you also get that generalizability. So now what I study in my small sample size, I can then generalize that to a larger population. I don't have to collect data on everyone in the United States. If in fact my small population is representative of people I would find here in the United States, I can then generalize what I find in my small population to the larger United States population. And then finally, we need to make sure that our sample size is sufficient, that we have enough participants in our sample to be able to detect effects whenever we run analyses. Okay, so when we are sampling from our population, you can do so in two ways. You can have a probability sampling, and this is the type of sampling procedure in which I'm able to specify the probability that any member of a population will be included in my sample. This is slightly different from a non-probability sampling, which is a type of sampling where I cannot specify the probability that any member of the population will be included in my particular sample. Sampling has to assure that external validity because remember, our point and our goal is to be able to generalize our findings to the larger population. When we think about sample size, you might say, well, how many participants do I need to collect data on? And this is going to differ. In general, larger samples provide more accurate estimates of the population. That being said, if you have a large enough sample size, you will inevitably find something significant. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is something significant that's worthwhile. So what we really need to do is there are statistical programs that we can run that will allow us to appropriately calculate an N, which is the sample size that we would need based on the number of variables that we have and the number of predictions that we're hoping to come up with. So this is something that you'll talk about in greater detail when you get into statistics, but it is important that you do run some sort of analyses to figure out the ideal sample size you would need to detect significance in your population. In general, we can think about manipulations being in two different ways. We can either have a straightforward manipulation, and we'll talk about our next staged manipulation in just a second. In a straightforward manipulation, we are doing a direct and simple manipulation, okay? So in this case, in the example I'm going to give you, what we manipulated was our word usage, what words we used. So Goldstein and colleagues in 2008, they were very interested in the influence of signs at hotels, and those signs that you see when you check into a hotel about conserving water, right? And if you keep your towel hanging up, you can use it for another day. If you leave it on the floor, that means we'll replace it and wash it, right? Well, the hotels want you to reuse your towels because it saves them on cost of washing those towels. And so in this experiment, they wanted to see if they could manipulate behavior based on the types of words they use. So in the first example, they had a little sign that said, "Help, save the environment. You can show your respect of nature and help save the environment by reusing your towels during your stay." When they did this, 35% of guests reused their towels. They then had another manipulation, and on the card they wrote something like this: "Join your fellow guest in helping to save the environment." Almost 75% of guests who are asked to participate in our new resource saving program do help by using their towels more than once. When this was printed on the card, the number jumped up to 44%. 44% of guests ended up reusing their towels. So here, just a simple manipulation of words actually produced a change in the number of people that were willing to reuse their towels. In a staged manipulation, here we're going to use a confederate or an accomplice. For example, and we do so for two reasons. One, the researcher may be trying to create some sort of state, right, for our participant. Something like frustration or anger. We can't tell people to get angry, right? So we have to get somebody else, our confederate or our accomplice, to help us create that feeling. We also might need a confederate or accomplice because it's necessary. If we think about Milgram, right, the shock experiment, we needed a confederate to be in on it so we could see what our participants' behavior would be. Would they continue to shock their partner, right, in our case, their confederate, until XXX, death? We actually find that bigger effects can be produced with stronger manipulations. So things like alcohol or mood. And then we need to think about the factors that are being manipulated. So do we have multiple levels of the same factor, or are we comparing only two levels of a factor, right? So what are we kind of comparing? What are we looking for in that manipulation? We also need to think about limiting factors, things like ethics. Is it ethical for us to conduct the research study in the way that we want to? The cost, right? Whether that be with time or money. We also should think about the types of measures that we'll be using to measure a dependent variable. So we talked about survey research within this self-report measures, right? So here we give a survey to our participant and we ask them to fill that out. You could also collect data using a behavioral measure, and this is directly observing a behavior that's taking place. We can also measure our DVV with as a physiological measure, and here you could record responses to the body. Maybe we're looking at heart rate, right? So we could monitor heart rate throughout our experiment. sometimes it's really good for us to have multiple measures, and we talked about this in some of our chapters before, particularly when we're looking at a DV. We also should consider the sensitivity of our dependent variable. So you want to consider both ceiling effects and floor effects. Sometimes when we are running an experiment, a task is so easy that everyone actually does well regardless of the conditions that are manipulated by the independent variable. This result is what we would call a ceiling effect, right? Everybody is equally doing well. And what we end up seeing as a result of the ceiling effect is the independent variable then appears to have no effect at all on the dependent measure. But this is only because our participants are quickly getting to that max level of performance. They're kind of scoring at the top of the charts. The opposite problem then would be when a task is so difficult that hardly anyone can perform well. And this would be that floor effect. So kind of going back to multiple different measures, using multiple measures of a DV can provide a lot of good data. In fact, it can sort of provide this convergent support for a conclusion that we have. Basically, if we assume that all of these different measures should produce similar outcomes, then we can compare those outcomes with each other. Order effects are something that can also be of concern. We discussed this in our basic research design, some of the ways that we might deal with those order effects. We also should consider some additional controls here. One thing is kind of controlling for participants' expectations. And this could be related to demand characteristics. And this basically informs the purpose of the study to the participant, right? So we're giving our participants their consent form. If we already know everything that's taking place in the study, will it influence the outcome of what we're hoping to measure? In some cases, yes. In other cases, maybe not. But regardless, we should consider this and how we are going to be presenting that research then to our participants. A placebo group could be used to help us, particularly when we are doing some kind of medical trial, right? And so maybe we want to see the effectiveness of a drug. If we give everyone the drug, we have no way of knowing whether the results we are seeing is because of the drug itself or because people believe that the drug is supposed to do X for them. So if we are testing out, say, a drug for the common cold, and people say, oh yeah, I feel really good, I don't feel any symptoms of getting a cold. Is that because the drug is working, or is it because people believe that they don't have any symptoms, right? Because that's what the medication is supposed to do. So on one side, we've got what our participants are expecting to happen. The other side is the experimenter. As experimenters, we might even say something that influences a behavior. So let's say we're giving a medication to look at depression. Well, if we know that one group of our participants has the drug and one group does not, if when we pass along the drug to one group, we say, yes, so this drug, will show improvement in mood. And then for our other group, and we know it's a placebo, we say, this drug may influence improvement in mood. Now, even that small word can influence a participant and what they respond back. So we can do single blind and double blind studies. A single blind study is when the participant is unaware of whether they're getting a placebo or the actual drug. Drug trials will at minimum have a single blind experiment. Really good clinical trials will actually have a double blind experiment, which means that neither the participant nor the experimenter knows whether their participant is getting a placebo or the actual treatment. So at my husband's job, they test out drugs for Alzheimer's, and they actually have a partitioned area where the pharmacist will sit, and it's a black screen, so you can't even see each other. There's a small window that opens up, and you can slide the pills out, and it'll be in a little cup. And so they just knock and say that they're ready for the pills, and only the pharmacist knows who got which pills. This is kept in a separate sheet that they don't look at until they get all of the results back. Then they can compare to see if there's any improvement. That means the person who's administering the test, who's administering the drugs to the participant, doesn't know if they're actually getting the drug or the placebo. And this actually allows that interaction to be more clean, that you might not say something that could influence the result, because now it is simply the effects of the drug. So these are some of the highlights to take away from our chapter. I also want to point out to you that we've got several key terms as well. So please do make sure you take a look at your readings for this week, and also kind of come with any questions that you might have to class so I can help make any clarifications. So we'll go ahead then and we'll end for today. But as always, if you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer them. Have a great day. Bye.